topic is the quadratic formula. Basically, we try to use the quadratic formula whenever we cannot factor a quadratic equation. So here we're going to have a quadratic equation. And again, when it's quadratic, we're talking about something that's got an x squared in it and an x term. We want it to equal 0 on one side. And the hope was that it factors. If it doesn't factor and all else fails, what will always work is our quadratic formula. It always works. And it's not an easy formula, but it's not too bad. It's x equals negative b plus or minus. Do not forget the plus or minus. The plus or minus here makes sure that we get our two answers because it's squared. Again, we might get two of the same answer, but we still are technically getting two answers. So plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, if you're one of those people who has seen this before and has always had trouble memorizing this, what I would highly recommend is either making sure you know a little story or a song that can go along with this. Music, they've shown, is really good at making something stick in your head for a very long period of time. So I do know that there's a version of the quadratic formula on YouTube that is that is done to the Addams Family theme song. And I would do something like watch it 2 to 3 times a day. And guess what? And actually listen to it and pay attention. It may be slightly irritating, but at the same time, you'll probably remember it because it is irritating. And it somehow, when you link something to music, you do remember it better. Or you can do something like a story, like there once was a negative boy, that's why you get the negative b, who was all mixed up, that's your plus or minus. So he went to a radical party, that's the square root. But because the boy, that's your b, was squared, why it's squared, he lost, that's your minus, out on 4 awesome chicks, that's your 4ac. He cried his way home when it was all over, that's your fraction, at 2 a.m., that's your 2a. That's another way of kind of keeping this as a way to remember it. It's really up to you. The problem is, it is a detailed formula. It's very easy to just misremember one part of it, which is why it's super important that you show your work on a test and send me your scratch paper. Now, what's going to be our main focus is this tiny part that's underneath the square root, the b squared minus 4ac. That actually has a special name. It's called the discriminant, because whatever's underneath the square root is going to determine what kind of answers we get, whether or not they're real or imaginary. Because remember, if we get negatives underneath the square root, what happens when you get a negative under the square root? It comes out as an imaginary. It comes out as an I. So we get what are called complex numbers. When you have a positive underneath the square root, you get no i's, which means you're getting real numbers. If you get a nice clean number that you can take the square root of, then you get something that's called rational. And the reason why it's called rational is because you will have no square roots in your final answer. However, if you actually can't fully take the square root of something, and you end up with square roots in your final answer, instead of it being called rational, you end up with something that's called irrational. And again, the quadratic formula is really nice because it's something that always works. It's like saying I've got a nail and I've got a sledgehammer. The sledgehammer, no matter what, is always going to work. The quadratic formula is our sledgehammer. However, it's big, it's not pretty, and it takes a while. So in this first example, what we have is we have an equation that's a quadratic equation. There is a problem, though, with how it looks right off the bat. Is notice we have 9x squared minus 6x equals a negative 7. The problem with this equation, though, is that it's a quadratic equation, but it doesn't equal 0 yet. So we need to make it equal to 0 first by adding a 7 to both sides of the equation. And now we've got 9x squared minus 6x plus 7 equals 0. And the hope would be is that we could factor this, but in order to factor this, you'd be looking for what two factors of 9 times 7, which is 63, add up to the middle number, which is a negative 6. And there is no two factors of positive 63 that add up to a negative 6. That's how you know that this doesn't factor. However, we can do the quadratic formula because remember that always works. It's our sledgehammer. It will always work. So what we're going to do is we're going to write out our a, which is always the number that's out in front of the x squared term, which here is a 9. Our b, which is a negative 6, is always in front of the x term, and then the c is always by itself at the end. That's the 7. And so we can do our quadratic formula using this a, b, and c. The formula, though, however, is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's go ahead and fill in all of our a, b's, and c's. So we've got our a is 9. That's going to go in 2 spots. We've got our b is negative 6. That's again going to go in 2 spots. And we've got, let's see, a c, which is our 7 is only going to go in 1 spot. So let's see how this is going to work. However, what we're going to first do is plug in our b, which is negative 6. Notice this first b that we're going to plug in, though, actually has a negative out in front of it already, which means that negative 6 that we're going to plug in, that negative out in front is going to turn it back into a positive 6, plus or minus, we've got the square root of, now the next thing that we've got is, we've got the negative 6 getting plugged in, but notice that negative 6, or that b there, is squared, minus 4 times, we said that a was 9, and c was 7. And then it's all over 2 times a, and a is again 9. So where we want to start on this is we want to start with what's underneath the square root that has the highest order in the order of operations, which in this problem, it's going to be the exponent. So we're going to start off by working on our exponent, which is going to be our negative 6 squared. Well, negative 6 squared is negative 6 times the negative 6, which is actually a positive 36. We have our minus sign that comes next. We might as well go ahead and work left or right and do our multiplication next, which is our 4 times 9 times 7. Well, let's see. 4 times 9 times 7 is, but doing the 4 times 9 times 7, we get a 252. So now the next thing that we need to do is just finalize what is underneath this square root by simplifying the 36 minus 252. Let's go ahead and do that final operation underneath the square root and see what we end up with. So far we've still got the 6, the plus or minus, still have the square root, and now let's see what we end up with underneath that square root. When we do the 36 minus 252, we end up with a negative 216. And on the bottom, we can go ahead and simplify that. That's already just by itself. It's a 2 times 9, which is 18. Continuing along, so we have a 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 216 over 18. And we can't reduce it quite yet until we reduce the square root. So the question is, how can we break down 216? What can we break off that we can indeed take the square root of? Well, remember, 216 is divisible by 6. Actually, it's divisible by 36. It's 36 times 6. So here's the idea, is now we've got 6 plus or minus the square root of negative. We've got the 36 and the 6. 36 times 6. Well, let's see what this is going to do for us. So we've got our 6 out in front, our plus or minus. When we take the square root of the 36, it's going to come out as a 6. We also, though, have a negative underneath our square root, which will come out as an I. However, there is this other 6 that's inside of our square root that we can't take the square root of 6, though, so it's going to stay inside of our square root. And then we still have our 18 on the bottom. Now, what's nice is now that this can reduce because everything is divisible by a factor of 6. And when I mean everything that's outside of a square root. Because remember, anything that's inside of a square root is safe. So everything that's outside of a square root, each and every piece has to be reduced by a factor of 6 to be considered reduced and in lowest terms. So when we divide the 6 into the first 6, we get a 1. Dividing the 6 into the second 6, we get another 1i, so we get plus or minus. We get a 1. I, square roots of 6. Again, remembering that what's inside the square root is safe. We still have to reduce what's on the denominator, the 18, by a factor of 6, which will leave us with a 3. Continuing along, the only thing we don't have to write in this answer is the 1 that's in front of the I. It's just not necessary, so we're going to rewrite it without the 1. So what this will leave us with is 1 plus or minus I square roots of 6 over 3. So that's two separate answers. We've got 1 plus I square roots of 6 over 3 and 1 minus I square roots of 6 over 3. And those are our two final answers.